I'm very happy and honored to be, well, here, there, let's say together today. So as a point of departure, I would like to consider the very common expression, "it's written all over your face," which gives us a clue of the diffused conception of the face as a surface through which something which is inside us makes itself visible to the outside. This reminds us, as Patrizia Magni effectively pointed out, that the face, I'm quoting, is above all, in a passive sense, visus, that is to say, the part of us, of our person, and not only of our body, that is more exposed to visibility. It is the part of us that remains most entangled in the game of looks, of seeing and being seen, of showing off and hiding, as we discussed also before. So, how can a face be read? I'm quoting Magni again: "The complexity of the face as an observable, decipherable, and describable object has always posed a quantity of questions that at different times have found different answers. So definitely it is not an easy task. However, different models and methodologies to read the face have been developed across time, spreading around the world. So I'm going to consider here some of the most popular and relevant cases in order to highlight in the end of my presentation the main effects of meaning resulting from them. So among the most renowned examples, mention should be certainly made to the practice known as Mian Shang, literary face reading, which was developed in China more than 3 millennia ago by Taoist healers and monks, and is still in vogue among practitioners of so-called traditional Chinese medicine and various currents in alternative medicine, also in Western countries nowadays. So this model relies on the identification of a correspondence between specific organs or parts of our body, such as, for instance, the liver or heart, and particular areas of the face, so for example, the eyebrows or nose. In such a view, issues related to the former manifest themselves with alterations of the latter, rashes, skin discoloration, dryness, and so on and so forth, in a logic that places the disease on a marked pole and health on an unmarked pole. The aspects considered in the practice of Mian Shang, however, are not limited to the purely physiological dimension, but embrace different factors. A crucial reference, for example, is the conceptual model of Wu Xing, or 5 elements, which are linked to each other by positive or negative relations. So the visual representation of such links has given rise to a series of holistic maps of the face, as you can see here on the screen, which in addition to physical health involve a wide range of elements, such as personality, temperament, talents, etc., putting them in direct correlation with specific points of our face. Note that face reading is completely excluded from a Western medical practice, which has also historically attributed the fundamental role to the face. As Jean Starobinsky recalled, in fact, a solid tradition required to expose human anatomy a capite ad calcem, that is to say, from head to heel. The method is still followed in some contemporary medical schools as a rule of preliminary clinical description. The face will therefore be the object of primary attention, whatever part of the body is designated by the patient's complaints. And with good reason, he states, in a first approximation, it is the face that reveals the state of alertness, numbness, and consciousness. Thus, a first measurement of the severity of the disease becomes possible. Hippocrates himself, who is considered the father of Western medicine, as we know, underlined the importance of observing the face in a famous passage from his Prognosticon. He, the physician, should observe thus in acute diseases, first the countenance of the patient, if it be like those of persons in health, and more so if like itself, for this is the best of all, he states. Now, this finds correspondence in the concept of facets, that is to say, the appearance of the face characteristic of particular pathological conditions, which is still fundamental in the processes of medical diagnosis. Echoing the Mian Shang somehow, medical treatises distinguish between a facies composita, that is to say, the unaltered face of healthy people, which, as I showed in a recent paper on the face of health, seems to be irrepresentable as such, and the multiplicity of facets marked and so represented in various ways, such as, for instance, the Hippocratic facets, facets virile, and the acromegalic facets that you can see here, and several others. However, compared to other approaches, Western medicine has highlighted the limits of face reading, at least if not accompanied by other types of analysis. So Western medicine insists on the fact that the anatomical structures that make up the face are varied and can be altered in different ways, emphasizing the role played by factors such as age, sex, race, individual constitution, degree of consciousness, character, and also cultural influences. So quoting Starobinsky again, the temptation to believe that all affections are inscribed in the face is great, and in every age, the presumptuous observer has been able to believe to be in possession of a universal semiology. The presumption consists in believing that the face offers adequate and sufficient clues. Yet, judgment of people's health based on their facial appearance remain fundamental in diagnostic and prognostic practices, as well as in everyday life, also resulting in forms of social isolation and stigmatization. And we shouldn't forget the crucial role that the so-called physiognomy has played in the Western hemisphere. From the Greek physis, meaning nature, and gnomon, judge, physiognomy is the practice of assessing people's personality and identity, so we're going beyond health, by analyzing their body and especially their face. This approach originated in classical antiquity, spreading both in the East and in the West. The earliest known systematic treatise on physiognomy is a Physiognomonica ascribed to Aristotle, which is divided into two parts, conjectured to have been originally two different works. So the first 6 chapters are devoted to the consideration of the method of study, the general science of character, the particular appearances, characteristic of the dispositions, of strength and weakness, genius and stupidity, and so on. Then the characters derived from the different features and from color, hair, body, and so on are taken into consideration. While discussing noses, for instance, the author claims that those with thick, bulbous hands belong to persons who are insensitive, swinish. Sharp-tipped noses belong to the irascible, those easily provoked, like dogs. Rounded, large, obtuse noses to the magnanimous, the lion-like. Slender, hooked noses to the eagle-like, and so on and so forth. The general idea, as reported by Aristotle himself in prior analytics, is that it is possible to infer character from features, if it is granted that the body and the soul are changed together by the natural affections. After Aristotle, we can find references to physiognomy in different authors and works, including Juvenal, Suetonius, Pliny the Elder, and also Christian scholars. What is interesting to point out here is that while the earlier classical physiognomy was primarily descriptive, the later medieval studies particularly developed its predictive and astrological side, digressing so into prophetic folklore and also magic. Then in Western culture, physiognomy experienced the period of fervent development in the 16th century, especially with the work of Giovan Battista della Porta, who described how people's temperament influences their facial appearance and character, and also used woodcuts of animals to illustrate human characteristics, as you can see here on the screen. He was followed by Lavater, whose work introduced the idea that physiognomy relates to the specific character traits of individuals rather than general types. I'm going very fast here, I'm sorry, but we do not have the time to stop on the details. And then by Franz Gall, who developed the theory of organology and the method of cranioscopy, later known as phrenology. Now, the main idea supported by Gall's work is that analyzing the external shape of the skull, and so we are speaking here of the entire head, allows making assumptions about people's personality and development of mental and moral faculties. And finally, mention should be certainly made to Cesare Lombroso, who proposed physiognomy as a means of detecting criminal tendencies. I'm quoting here an extract from his famous work, Criminal Man. At the sight of that skull, I seem to see all of a sudden the problem of the nature, that's very important, of the criminal, an atavistic being who reproduces in his person the ferocious instincts of primitive humanity and the inferior animals. Thus were explained anatomically the enormous jaws, high cheekbones, prominent superciliary arches, solitary lines in the palms, extreme size of the orbits, handle shapes or sessile ears found in criminals, savages, and apes. Insensibility to pain, extremely acute sight, tattooing, excessive idleness, love of orgies, and the irresistible craving for evil for its own sake. The desire not only to extinguish life in the victim, but to mutilate the corpse, tear its flesh, and drink its blood, everything in a face or more generally in a head. So according to Lombroso, a good portion of criminals have an innate criminality that is difficult for them to resist and can be inferred from the face and more generally the head, including the skull after their death, of course. Followers of his schools then placed an emphasis on the need of removing born criminals from society rather than seeking to reform them. A number of racist stereotypes also characterize his work. Oblique eyelids, a Mongolian characteristic, the projection of the lower face and jaws found in Negroes, a nose with a form found among the Akas, a tribe of pygmies of Central Africa, and other examples were some of the features that Lombroso singled out as indicative of criminality. After Lombroso, physiognomy suffered a progressive lull of interest and was discarded as a para-scientific discipline, as it is still considered today. However, it is still widely accepted and practiced in Eastern cultures, especially in China, as well as in a number of Western subcultures, and has been generally connected to divination, so claiming a relation between facial features and destiny in a strongly deterministic view. But let's move beyond physiognomy. Beyond physiognomy, face reading has been widely used by Western scientists in relation to the study of emotions. Darwin's attempt to identify and catalog emotions is certainly the most relevant example in this field. Here, for instance, you can read a brief description of disgust. Now, let's go directly to the point. So with respect to the face, it states moderate disgust is exhibited in various ways, by the mouth being widely opened as if to let an offensive morsel drop out. And then extreme disgust is expressed by movements around the mouth identical with those preparatory to the act of vomiting. The mouth is opened widely, with the upper lid strongly retracted, which wrinkles the sides of the nose, and with the lower lip protruded and diverted as much as possible. So the role of face reading immediately emerged as crucial in the identification of this emotion as well as in others. What is more, noting that primates make facial movements that look like human expressions of emotion, Darwin argues that face expressions must have some adaptive function. Curling the lip and wrinkling the nose and narrowing the eyes in disgust, for instance, might have originated to protect the individual against noxious pathogens. Only as social behavior started to develop, according to Darwin, did these facial expressions take on a more communicative role. Ekman then added further elements to this description and also highlighted that some traits of the expressions Darwin described, such as the movements of the lips, were unable to apply broadly to cultures as others do. In fact, Ekman has resolutely and repeatedly claimed that emotional states can be reliably inferred from expressions on the face, since emotional expressions are universal. This is a point which was already present in Darwin's thought. More specifically, in a paper dated in 1969, Ekman, together with Drazen, maintained the existence of a pan-cultural element in facial displays of emotion. According to the authors, I'm quoting, facial expressions of emotions are similar among humans, regardless of culture, because of their evolutionary origin. Despite some handicaps in recognition that they admit, they highlight that their finding contradicts the theory that facial displays of emotion are socially learned and therefore culturally variable. In a subsequent paper, a limit to the previous study is admitted, and the new research is carried out with the aim of showing that also members of a pre-literate culture with minimal exposure to literate cultures, more precisely a community from New Guinea, would associate the same emotion concepts with the same faces as do members of Western and Eastern literate cultures. So this means that, they avoid exposure to what we generally call the collective imaginary. And unfortunately, we do not have the time to go into the details of these analyses, which are indeed very interesting, also as regards to the type of text that are used in relation to the face. But what is important to highlight here is that Ekman and Friesen insist again on the fact that particular facial behaviors are universally associated with particular emotions. Now, largely unchallenged for a generation, these ideas are now largely questioned by researchers. The picture, in fact, seems to be a lot more complicated. Facial expressions do vary widely between context and cultures, as remarked, for instance, by Rachel Jack, who recently stated, East Asian facial expressions of the main 6 emotions, the same studied by Ekman, tend to be signaled primarily with the eye region, eyebrows and differences in the eyes, while with Westerners, the face movements tend to vary more in the mouth region, as you can see in the example shown on the screen. And this is interestingly mirrored in cultural emoticons, as you can see here. What is more, while it is certain that our faces are powerless to hide completely our emotions, it should not be forgotten that people can fake emotions, and to a certain extent also facial movements. Darwin himself used pictures of simulations for his work, as he writes. So the variation certainly goes beyond the aspects mentioned by Ekman. Other elements, such as body movement, personality, tone of voice, and changes in skin tone, moreover, have important roles in how we perceive and display emotion, as the research led by Ohio University recently demonstrated. For instance, changes in emotional state can affect blood flow, and this in turn can alter the appearance of the skin. And here you can see an example on the screen. Finally, the visual context, such as the background scene, for instance, as well as the temporal context, can provide clues to someone's emotional state. Even in the case of detecting emotions through face reading, a certain presumption to be in a possession of a universal semiology emerges. Yet, companies and governments are still referring to the face as a sort of emotion oracle. This happens, for instance, when reading the emotions of a defendant is used as part of a fair trial, or with programs intended to teach how to monitor transport passengers for doses on potentially suspicious signs that can indicate stress, deception, or fear. And a program like that actually exists. Well, it existed in 2007. Or with increasing use of software and apps detecting emotions for different aims, such as assessing the suitability of job candidates, detecting lies, making adverts more alluring, and also diagnosing disorders from dementia to depression, etc. So, this has been a brief and very rapid, I'm sorry, and certainly not exhaustive overview, but I think it allows us to draw some general conclusions on face reading and the narratives emerging through it. So like in any operation of textual interpretation, in the cases we have considered so far, the look of the reader, that is the observer, is fundamental. After all, as I said in the beginning of this presentation, recalling the work of Patrizia Magni, the face is above all, in a passive sense, visus, a surface exposed to the look of the other, and Massimo also interestingly remarked, which is framed, we could say recalling Maria Giulia's presentation, that is given meaning by such look and such other. So from the Mienshang to the pan-cultural description of emotions operated by Darwin and his successors, we find in fact different acts of focalization or enclosure of the face, which depending on the specific look reading it, tells different tales, made of health, illness, passions, predispositions, emotions, moral inclinations, divinations, and so on and so forth. However, the role of the reader seems to be mostly, if not completely, neglected. The face generally emerges as a sort of window, a sort of transparent window, letting the inside manifest itself on the outside. Or if we want to resume ancient dualistic oppositions, the sound finds expression in the body, the res cogitans become res extensa, passion become flesh, and so on, in a deterministic veridictory process whereby what seems, the face, the appearance, the aspect, as this is generally described by the dictionary, is what is, the nature of man, conceived now as a moral disposition, now as a divinatory sign, now as a symptom of predestined disease, and so on and so forth. It is here that the presumption to possess a universal semiology, as Stravinsky calls it, arises. Although different from each other and not always oriented to the same ends, all the operations of face reading we have examined here, and which are still present in different ways around us, consider the face able to offer adequate and sufficient clues to make inferences on people, health, emotions, behavior, fate, moral dispositions, and so on and so forth. This happens on the basis of a movement consisting basically in searching for constants capable of constructing typology and classes in which to classify the analyzed objects, the faces. And so pan-cultural codes, to recall the terminology employed by Ekman, or more generally universal codes, as evidenced by physiognomy, in which the characteristics linked to race, as we have seen in Lombroso, can even become the mirror of a greater or lesser inclination to crime. So on the one hand, these operations are not only interesting, but fundamental, I would say, since they try to understand how faces and their units produce meaning and to detect the grammar of such a process of signification. On the other hand, however, they are highly problematic as they forget that the face is not a given object, which is directly accessible, but rather a reality continuously reconstructed. We have already highlighted this aspect with respect to Ekman and Darwin, illustrating recent criticism to their approach. Surely there is a sort of common substrate to the expression of the face. So the same muscle bundles, the same joints, the same movements allowed or prevented, and etc. But passing from the material dimension of the me-flesh, le corps chair, as Jacques Fontanille would call it, to the much more articulated and complex reality of the myself envelope, le corps propre, things change radically. It is no longer the case of a composite totality in existence that simply participates in the transformation of the states of things, but rather of a coherent unit in experience, that is to say, the body in construction, the living vehicle of intentionality and interaction support, and therefore particularly the support of confrontation with otherness. Such otherness, in fact, defines the pertinent traits underlying the reading of the face. Should we focus on movements, or rather on colors, lines, points of conjunction, symmetries or irregularities, and so on and so forth? Definitely far more complex and varied grammars than those described by the analyzed cases are needed. Grammars that are obviously linked to cultural as well as to individual variations that cannot be denied, as in fact happens. Furthermore, it cannot be forgotten that the face can also be controlled, faked, masked, with evident effects on its interpretation. After all, as Umberto Eco remarked, if something cannot be used to tell a lie, conversely, it cannot be used to tell the truth. It cannot be, in fact, used to tell at all. The face, in other words, is a sign, the union of a signifier and a signified, something that stands for something to someone in some capacity, and as such, as we know, is necessarily linked to a certain degree of arbitrariness. even with respect to the mere perceptual level, although there is undoubtedly a neurophysiological level from which the recognition of a face necessarily originates. As Maggie recalls, recognizing a face means assigning it to a class. In this sense, the perceptual experience seems to be already oriented by a cultural filter between the face in front of us and our irresistible vocation to interpret it, to read it. Culture inevitably interposes itself. After all, the philosophy, anthropology, and last only in a chronological order, semiotics of the body are clear about this. In this part of material culture, there are no constant or universal combinations, exactly as it happens for language. Contingency and history, in fact, dominate. It is in this sense, and I'm going toward the very conclusions of my presentation, that the face always remains a possible point of view, a multiple object, irreducible to unity, a narrative treasure, as Massimo told us before, and I would say a semiotic one too, more generally. Now, the attempt of the processes of face reading that we have considered here seem to go in the opposite direction, denying such plurality, or at least reducing it to a very small number of categories considered universal and more linked to a supposed nature than to cultural variance. Thus, they deny the fundamental process of translation underlying the face reading, which at a closer look is clearly discernible also in the drawings used in physiognomy, as well as in the images adopted by Darwin and Ekman, or in the digital reconstructions used by government software and commercial apps, etc. And generally, this comes with normative outcomes which formalize the axiological and ideological systems regulating the face and its interpretation. They establish what traits are conforming and what are not, what is beautiful and what is ugly, what is bad and what is good, etc., often without remedy. Now, even though similar positions appear evidently mistaken to us, and the scientific universe is also tending more and more to distance itself from them, as we have seen, their roots in everyday life, and especially in literary, iconographic, media, and sometimes even legal texts, as highlighted in the presentation, are strong. And so is its persistence in the collective imaginary, with the still wide diffusion of practices that forget the constructed, artificial, and semiotic character of the face. It is therefore essential to remark that only by recovering such a semiotic dimension can the tales of the face emerge in all their complexity and variety. Anyone aiming at reading a face, in other words, should necessarily look at the socio-cultural context that shape and at the same time express its various forms, thus revealing its different facets, we could say faces, depending on who looks at it, who questions it, who wants to be told and tell its tales. So following Massimo's provocation, I would therefore conclude saying that this is maybe one of the most relevant paradoxes of contemporary societies. And with this, I thank you for your attention.